we're going to talk about is we're going to deal with biology and a very important topic that's called cellular respiration. Previously, we just got done talking about photosynthesis. Remember, in photosynthesis, the goal of photosynthesis was for that autotrophic organism to produce sugar. Okay, so photosynthesis is the process by which autotrophs have the ability to produce sugar. Now, we can't produce sugar, okay? We don't have the ability to produce sugar because we're what we call heterotrophs. And we have to find our food from an external source is where we have to find our food. So we have to physically go out and get our food is what we have to do. So the process of cellular respiration that we're going to talk about next is the ability of an organism not to produce sugar, but to be able to take this sugar and produce energy as a result of it in order to build what's called ATP. And ATP is what cells run on. All cells run on, for the most part, they run on ATP. So the ability to get your muscle to contract, that's going to be, that ability is controlled by the ability of having ATP within that muscle. The ability of cells to move and do things like that, if you're a single cellular organism and you have to be able to move to get around and things like that, that process is going to be controlled by ATP. So ATP is what cells run on. Cellular respiration is the process by which cells take this sugar, okay, and they take this sugar and they break the bonds of this sugar, and they're able to use this energy that's released from these bonds to generate ATP. So let's get started. So we can see, this is what we learned from photosynthesis itself. So in photosynthesis, okay, we were taking in water, not we, but the autotrophic organism was taking in water and CO2, okay, and the energy from the sun, and they were using this to produce sugar and oxygen. All right. Now, if you take a look at cellular respiration, we call this aerobic cellular respiration because oxygen is going to be used. Anytime you see this aerobic, that means that oxygen is going to be used in this particular process itself. We can see that we take these products from photosynthesis, and they're used in the reactants of cellular respiration. All right, so I can see that this is where that sugar and oxygen come into. Okay, a byproduct, or what's being produced, not necessarily a byproduct, but what's being produced in this aerobic cellular respiration process is water, CO2, and then energy. This energy is going to be used to produce ATP. We can see that these H2O and CO2 are then going to be used in the reactants of photosynthesis. So we can kind of see how we have this cyclical thing that's occurring. Okay, the reactants of one are going to be used, or going to be produced in the products of another one, is what's going to happen in the process itself. All right, so we can kind of see how they're related to one another, photosynthesis and this cellular respiration process that we're going to take a look at. Next, I'm going to show you guys what ATP looks like, okay? What ATP looks like. Remember, ATP is the fuel that cells run on. Your car runs on gas, okay? Our cells run on a molecule that's called ATP. So let's take a look at what ATP is and what it looks like. All right, on this diagram here, guys, I want you to turn and take a look at this molecule right here because this is the important thing we're going to be talking about. This is ATP. ATP is short for adenosine triphosphate. When you take a look at your review guide, you'll see that it asks what ATP stands for. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate, and that's right here. This triphosphate means that it has 3 phosphates on it. So if I look at the end of this molecule, I can see there's 3 phosphates. Okay? This is what your cell runs on, is ATP. When it uses ATP, it breaks this bond in between this phosphate right here. And now what we have, as a result of this process, when I break the bond, okay, of this phosphate group, I'm going to have then what's called ADP, which is on this side. All right? So when I break down ATP, it becomes ADP. And I can see here, this is ADP. In order to get ADP, this is used up ATP, turned back into ATP, I have to add this phosphate group back here on the end of it. But in order to get this phosphate to get added on to the end of it, if I look at this equation, it requires energy. Where does this energy come from in order to join this phosphate back with its buddies? It comes from the breaking of bonds in that sugar. So as I break the bonds of this sugar molecule, it's going to release energy. This energy is going to be released, and this process is going to be used to help. Some of this energy is going to be used to join ADP with P to produce ATP. So we're basically in this cellular respiration process is we're going to recycle, okay, this ADP back into ATP is what we're going to do. And we're going to use as a fuel source for this, we're going to use the sugar as a fuel source to break these bonds in the sugar molecule to help drive this particular process itself. This is the chemical equation for aerobic cellular respiration. I showed you this a little bit earlier. I would write this one down. Okay, I would study this one extensively because this will be a question you will be asked on your test to know this particular equation itself. We're going to take sugar. We're going to take oxygen. Where do we get this sugar and oxygen from? We get the sugar and oxygen from carbohydrates or from plants. So we consume plants. We get this oxygen as a byproduct of photosynthesis. We take that in. This is going to be used to produce, okay, water. We exhale water. So we exhale water vapor. Breathe on a window sometime. You'll see that water vapor being exhaled. CO2 is produced, and then energy is going to be released. And this energy that's going to be produced is going to be used to generate ATP. In aerobic cellular respiration, the presence of oxygen, this process will yield enough energy to produce 36 ATP. Now, this is what we call aerobic cellular respiration. There is a process that happens when oxygen is not present that we'll talk about a little bit later. Like I said, there's two types of cellular respiration that we have. Okay, those two types of cellular respiration that we have are aerobic. This uses oxygen. This is anaerobic cellular respiration that does not use oxygen. Remember, anaerobic, no oxygen. Anaerobic, no oxygen is present, and the cells are not using oxygen, but they're still going to have the ability to produce energy that's going to produce ATP. This is the analogy. This slide just going on the idea that you know, we can think of glucose as a $100 bill, but your cells only run on $1 bills. So in order to get this $100 bill down into a $1 bill, we go through the process of cellular respiration is what we're going to do. Okay, because cells run on $1 bills. The $1 bill analogy would be like that's the ATP, and that's why we just can't use pure glucose as our source of the of energy that the cell runs on. The cell only runs on ATP. It doesn't run on glucose. So where does this actually occur? Okay, anaerobic respiration, okay, is going to occur outside the mitochondria. But we take a look at aerobic cellular respiration. They contain organelles inside the cell that we talked about called mitochondria. And mitochondrions, where we're going to see the bulk of this aerobic cellular respiration is going to occur in the mitochondria. Remember, we equated the mitochondria, and if we were taking a look at a factory, we equated it to kind of the powerhouse of the cell. Well, why is it called the powerhouse of the cell? Because this is the area where that energy is being produced in the form of ATP. These are the three stages. So right here is the three stages that we have of aerobic cellular respiration that we're going to talk about next. So the first stage that we have is called glycolysis. And this happens in the cytoplasm. Okay, we're basically going to take a 6-carbon sugar, okay, C6H12O6, and we're going to break it down into a molecule called pyruvate. And the process of breaking that molecule down into pyruvate, it's going to produce 2 ATP. All right, this happens in aerobic respiration, and this also happens in anaerobic respiration. So both aerobic and anaerobic respiration begin with the same process. It's called glycolysis. After this process, we now move into the mitochondria. So if oxygen is present, we're going to move in the mitochondria, and this pyruvate molecule is going to come into the mitochondria, and we're going to go through the Krebs cycle. And we're going to break this pyruvate down even further. And we break this pyruvate down even further, energy is going to be released. This energy that's going to be released is going to yield a total of 2 ATP. All right? We're then going to take this and we're going to break it down even further. Okay? So we're going to take those products from the Krebs cycle and we're going to run through the electron transport chain. And we're basically going to produce a total, in the electron transport chain, we're going to produce 32 ATP. But we can see, we started with sugar, we broke it down. We go to the Krebs cycle, we break down this pyruvate even further. We break down the products that we produced in the Krebs cycle even further, okay, to help regenerate ADP into ATP. And this is where a ton of energy is going to be produced, is in this electron transport chain itself. I don't expect you to know, okay, every little thing that happens in glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, or electron transport chain. I expect you to know where they occur. I expect you to know the amount of ATP that's being produced at each particular stage itself. But this is occurring in aerobic respiration is what's happening. This is an aerobic respiration. This little diagram that I'm showing you here is just going over the particular products that we have. I'm not asking you to understand fully what NADH is. Okay, these are electron carriers. Okay, they're carrying high energy molecules to the next stage, and then we're taking these high energy molecules and we're using them in the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain to help generate energy to produce ATP is what's going on. This is the energy that's going to be harvested out of each stage. So 32, 33, 34, 35, 36. We're going to produce a net total of around 36 ATP in this particular process. We have glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. So aerobic cellular respiration, guys, it produces a lot of energy that's going to generate a ton of ATP. It generates 36 ATP. But the downfall of this, guys, is it occurs super slow. Okay, so it occurs relatively slowly. And eventually there's going to be a cell inside of your body, okay, that's not going to be getting the oxygen that it needs. Okay, so you might have a set of muscle cells, and as long as we move at a relatively steady pace, hey, all these cells are able to get the oxygen that they need. But eventually, if you really exert yourself and you go all out, okay, there's going to be some cells that aren't able to get the oxygen requirements that they need, so they have to have another way to produce ATP. And that is done by what we call anaerobic cellular respiration. So this is called anaerobic cellular respiration when cells don't have enough oxygen being present. Some organisms also that we have out there live in an oxygen-free environment. How are they going to get the oxygen that they need? Well, they go through a process called anaerobic respiration. The benefit of anaerobic respiration is anaerobic respiration happens relatively quickly. Okay, it's not as efficient as aerobic respiration, but it does have the ability to produce ATP in a fast manner. You can see in this little diagram that's here this is anaerobic cellular respiration, and there's two processes that we can go through. So after we go through glycolysis, remember, both processes start with glycolysis. Both aerobic and anaerobic respiration start with glycolysis. We're going to produce two pyruvate molecules is what we're going to produce. Now, if oxygen is not present, now we're going to go through a process called fermentation. Okay? We go through what's called lactic acid fermentation. Yeast cells are going to go through alcohol fermentation. All right, so a byproduct of anaerobic respiration, okay, is going to be inside of us, we're going to produce lactic acid. This lactic acid is what's going to cause our muscles to become sore. If you're a yeast cell, you're going to produce alcohol as a byproduct of it. This lactic acid builds up inside the muscle, and eventually it will prevent a muscle from stop working. This is why you can't run forever. You can stay in anaerobic respiration for around 40 seconds. After that 40 seconds, that cell will stop working. It has to get oxygen back into it. One of the ways we get oxygen back into the system is we slow down. We take a break from that particular activity that's going to incorporate oxygen back into that system is what's going to happen because those cells are not working as hard as they once did. Like I said, anaerobic respiration is also called fermentation. This is the process by which energy is released from glucose when oxygen is not available. This process allows organisms to continue to produce energy until oxygen is available. However, this process only releases 2 ATP. The benefit, though, of anaerobic respiration is it happens quickly. It happens quickly. It will only last for about 40 seconds. So inside of us, it lasts for about 40 seconds. Inside of a muscle cell, that muscle will stop working after about 40 seconds, like I told you earlier. Here's the product that we're going to have. Anaerobic respiration is going to give you lactic acid as one of the byproducts. It's also going to produce alcohol in other organisms like yeast and things like this. This is how you make your alcohol. Like if you're making wine, you're taking grapes, you're adding yeast to those grapes, you're capping off, putting it in a little bottle, capping it off so it's in an oxygen-free environment, and those yeast are going to ferment and produce alcohol as a byproduct of their alcohol fermentation. Right here is your alcohol fermentation. This is the equation that we have here. You can see that there's no oxygen present. This is going to produce ethanol in this particular case, CO2 and 2 ATP. Anaerobic respiration, this is the product in yeast, is going to be alcohol fermentation. We do not ferment alcohol inside of us. We ferment lactic acid is what we're going to go through. So we produce lactic acid in the process, and this occurs, we go through lactic acid fermentation, like I said, when oxygen is not relatively available to those particular muscles themselves. This eventually is going to cause muscle cramping, muscle soreness, those types of things, and eventually that muscle will stop working, like I said. Like I said, this is minimal ATP production that's going to occur here. So we're producing a minimal amount of ATP, but it's happening relatively fast, is the advantage to anaerobic respiration. This is comparing the two, so when we take a look at the two, okay, so we know we get 36 ATP in aerobic respiration, okay. Aerobic respiration is efficient at its process, but like I said, it does not happen quickly. It does not happen quickly. If we take a look at different types of sports that you might be in, you might be in an aerobic workout that we're basically going to tap into, probably most of the time we're going to tap into aerobic cellular respiration. This is going to be a slower process, okay, that you're going to go through. You're not going like all out. It's not like a full sprint type of thing that you're doing. In an anaerobic race that you might be involved in, or anaerobic activity, this is going to require you to go through like extreme exertion. In that extreme exertion, these cells are going to be taking in a ton of oxygen, and eventually a cell is not going to be able to get the oxygen that it needs. So therefore, you're going to go through that lactic acid fermentation process. So that's cellular respiration in a nutshell. I did it relatively simply for you. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to come see me prior to taking the test. Thank you.